Oh, hey.
Hey,
Now it says we're live. Are we actually live? Or
we're
is it...
live. We're
Oh,
live.
oh shit.
Calling Chris Anderson in London,
This is Chris Anderson, actually in London as I speak, and calling Rick Beyer in.
Chicago.
Yeah, and we're live now, aren't we?
We are live for the first time in 27 days or 28 days. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Welcome to 2024, everybody.
How are your holidays?
My holidays were lovely. We stayed at home almost the whole time, so that was nice.
Did you do the post-New Year's weigh-in? I mean, how?
I weigh the same amount.
You lie like
I am 197 and a half.
You lie like
every day. Yeah.
Oh, please.
I can't seem to change that. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. Check it all out at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about John Hancock. So let us know that you're here. Let us know what you're drinking. Chris, did we lose everybody over the holidays, or did anybody come back today?
We've got quite a few. Brian Peacock's joining us from PA, and Doug McCord also from Pennsylvania. So, and the Templins. So we have a strong Pennsylvania contingent. Jim Stark, David Picker, also from Pennsylvania.
I see Ross W., who just joined as a Top Shelf patron. Maybe this is a good time to mention that you can support us, and we thank everybody who supports us. You may notice the names are getting a little smaller, Chris.
And we really appreciate that, yeah.
We had some new people. Homer Hodge just re-upped. Brenda Carlin came on. Chuck Court, and Ross W. So thank you, guys. And you can join us either as a Top Shelf patron or a Patreon supporter at any level, and we do appreciate them all at patreon.com/History Happy Hour.
Yes.
So, wow. There it is. Have we killed enough time?
I think so. We have quite a few people. And I also want to shout out Lizzie Borden. So we have somebody here representing this side of the puddle.
Oh, very well. Yes. We have
Thank you.
Somebody from the London area.
Greater London metropolitan.
That side of the pond.
Yes, right.
The losing side.
Excuse me. Let's not get started. The show hasn't even started yet. I mean, come on.
All right. Give me a cue.
All right.
Oh, I'm.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. I almost didn't play the open of the show. I'm a little rusty in the trigger finger. Today, we're going to be talking about John Hancock and the early days of our country, the pre-early days of our country, with someone who loves history and beer as much as we do.
Which is, so rare.
So Brooke Barbier is a public historian who received her PhD in American history from Boston College, specifically researching Boston's social and cultural life during and after the American Revolution. In 2013, she founded Ye Old Tavern Tours. This is something that we should be going on, which offers tours of Boston's historic sites and taverns, and beer is included. And she is the author of a new book, which is called King Hancock, and it's about how shall we describe him, Chris?
Well, you and I would probably describe him differently, Rick, so I would let you describe him.
The patriot leader and lead signer of the Declaration of Independence. So we bring on and say hello to Brooke Barbier. Brooke, how are you?
Hi, guys. Cheers.
Cheers. Hey, look,
what are you drinking?
I have what I'm calling a John Hancock. It's a cocktail. Yeah, it's Madeira based because John Hancock loved Madeira, and with some pins and ginger beer. So it tastes like a Coke, but then I've made it a cherry Coke by adding some cherry liqueur and some preserved cherries. So It's like cherry John Hancock.
I admire somebody that not only drinks when they talk about history, but puts a lot of thought and investment into it. Because Rick did a beer and I just did a scotch, but really, hats off.
Yeah.
We appreciate it, and our audience appreciates it. Look, everybody knows the name John Hancock, and everybody, at least in the U.S., knows that his name is at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence. A little bit larger, a little bit bolder than the other signatures. And honestly, Brooke, that's all they know about him. That's all many people know about him. So if you can start by giving us the quick overview, a sense of who he was and why you decided to write about him.
Who John Hancock was a merchant who lived in Boston. Merchant at this time meant he imported and exported goods to and from Boston and had several stores in Boston. He had inherited this business from his uncle. That's important to know that when he was 7, his dad died, and he went to live the rest of his life with his uncle who had founded this company, the House of Hancock. When John Hancock was 27, his uncle dies, and he inherits all of these business holdings. Not coincidentally, at this time, when he suddenly becomes a very wealthy man, he also gets a lot of attention and begins to get elected to political office. Hancock would eventually go on to become one of the most popular men in colonial North America. That is not an exaggeration. While we know his name today, in the 18th century, every American would have known his name. He becomes famous for that signature in his life and then much later in his life. And he signed first because he was the president of the Continental Congress.
All right. Rick.
Chris,
So why?
Chris, we
all
all
know all about
back
him
and
then.
forth.
You know all about him then, right?
Okay,
Oh.
you want to end the show now?
No, I want to end. No,
Thank you very much, Brooke.
Yeah.
We appreciate your
It's
coming
kind of a
on.
sore spot today. No, so, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about one of the things that I was interested in, and I think is important. Talk a little bit about his education and where you kind of think his sort of thought process comes from, and how that evolves.
He was educated at Boston Latin School, which was a feeder school to Harvard. And then many students from Harvard would go on to become ministers. And that, up until John Hancock's dad died, would have seemed like Hancock's path in life. He was the son of a minister named John Hancock, who was the son of a minister named John Hancock.
Stick with what you know.
Yeah, but for his dad dying, he probably would have gone on to become a minister and maybe not existed in the public realm at all. But that isn't what happened. When his dad dies, he goes to live with his uncle in Boston. He gets schooled at Boston Latin and then goes on to Harvard. And then his next step in his education is to act as an apprentice of sorts to his uncle. So that meant going around Boston and learning the business of the House of Hancock. And it also meant going to London and meeting some of the business partners there and spending time there as well.
So is there any indication, though, like from his education that he was radicalized, or he always had a chip on his shoulder, or like, do we know much about sort of where how he's forming these?
Isn't that a question? So I wouldn't say Hancock's gift is not political ideology. What his gift is garnering public support. And if I had to guess and make a very educated guess as his biographer, I would say that part of the reason he enters politics and likes it so much is because he wants to belong. When his dad dies, he goes to live with his uncle, and his uncle is a shrewd businessman. That doesn't mean that he couldn't be a loving guardian, but John Hancock leaves aside his other 2 siblings. He leaves aside his surviving mother and goes to live with an uncle and an aunt in the 3rd largest town in colonial America, and has to adjust to not just this new town, but this new home, much larger than the one he was used to, and these new guardians. And I think that it meant, and I say I think because we just don't have the evidence for it. He didn't have a diary where he wrote and he said, "Oh, I'm always longing to belong." But based on what we do know about him from his records or what other people said, it does seem like he spent his whole life wanting to feel seen and connected with people. And one great way to do that in the 18th century was in politics.
And his uncle and aunt had no other children, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why when John's dad, John, dies, that he goes to live with Uncle Thomas. Uncle Thomas had built this massive business, and in the 18th century, as in today, a common thing would be for the male heir to take over. And Thomas and his wife Lydia had no children of their own.
Okay, and I just want to add, since we're going to get into this, how did the family make all of its money?
So this is what's so interesting, because when people hear that Hancock inherited his wealth, they think, oh, that's boring. That's like everybody else. But what's very different is that Thomas Hancock was the middle of three boys, and the eldest and the youngest went to Harvard. And Thomas was apprenticed out into Boston as a bookseller. And in Thomas's lifetime, from apprentice to mogul, he built one of the largest fortunes in Massachusetts. That is unusual, to rise so far above your station without marrying into money. So Uncle Thomas is smart and shrewd and smuggles and supplies the British Army with provisions to combat the French. He goes on to buy real estate throughout New England. So he is an enterprising man, but he builds that fortune on his own.
Was that the smuggling was the part you were bringing?
Well, no, that's
the
illegality. I'm just like that he gets all of his money by charging the British government too much to feed the troops that are defending him. But we'll get into that as we go forward.
Hey, Brooke, you call John Hancock, actually in the subtitle of your book. My questions, I'm still questions based on the front cover, so I'll get to my questions based on the inside soon. You call John Hancock a moderate founding father. So what do you mean by that? Is he slow to champion the cause of independence? And if he is a moderate, as you say, how does he become, along with Samuel Adams, one of the two most prominent revolutionaries in Massachusetts and at that time in the 13 colonies, who the British really are most looking to string up if they can get their hands on them? Of course, Chris, in a legal, respectful.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I say that Thomas Gage, that's the general who occupies Boston in 1775, I say that he fundamentally misunderstands John Hancock and Samuel Adams by lumping them together, that they both are causing problems for the British Empire, but for different reasons. So I argue that Hancock's a moderate because he didn't tend towards the radical almost ever, even though he finds himself as one of the leaders of a revolution. But even more specifically, what we see with Hancock is that he goes in on the revolution and he comes out. He goes in and he comes out. Whereas someone like Samuel Adams, a radical through and through up until 1776, is always all in. He is always looking for some transgression by the British Empire. He is always trying to rile people up and see things from his perspective. Hancock, throughout the 1760s and 70s, is up until 76, he is looking for a return to normalcy, that he will rebel against taxes. But then if there's some sort of solution with those taxes, whether most of them are repealed or they're all repealed, that's enough to satisfy him, and he pulls out. To answer your question about independence, he is reluctant to declare independence, and he's not the only one. Most delegates to the Second Continental Congress were reluctant, and they eventually, many things moved them forward politically. But Hancock took some coaxing, and as late as April 1776, John Adams says of his cousin Samuel that Samuel was very upset with Hancock and was talking badly about him to other delegates because Hancock wasn't ready to declare independence.
And can I do a follow-up, Chris?
Sure.
Brooke, did you say that I think you said that Samuel Adams was a radical up until 1776. So I caught that and what do you mean by that?
It would depend on how you view radical thereafter. That Adams seems pretty singularly focused on independence, but after that, he might surprise you with, in what I would say is a pretty conservative view. Once the war is won, once the Constitution of Massachusetts is ratified in 1780, I think that he becomes much more conservative. And those protesting or wanting tax relief, he has much less sympathy for.
So, one of the, and I should probably lay my cards out here as a proud descendant of loyalists. I have a different view than Rick, but one of the charges I've often heard.
Do you view us as still being part of Great Britain, and that we might reunite someday?
It was just an unfortunate thing, and we're just going to have to deal with the consequences. You broke a few eggs, and we'll have to move on. But one of the charges that I've always heard leveled against Hancock, and I'm curious to get your opinion, is that he's not so much a reluctant revolutionary as an opportunist, and part of the reasons that he's in and out and off and on is he's in this for himself. And I mean, that's certainly a charge that people at the time leveled against him. So how would you answer that?
Well, first, let me address you being a descendant of loyalists. And I extend my sympathy, and not in the way that you might think that, like, oh, you lost the war. It's to say it was a very difficult time for everybody. Yes. And this is one of the things that I try to capture with Hancock, is that while we know today who won the war and how things turned out, those living in the time did not. And they were making the best choices for themselves, for their families at the time. And being a loyalist, especially in and around Boston, was very, very difficult. You might have your house smeared with manure. You might have your fence leveled, and feel the intimidation from your neighbors. So it's a difficult time for everybody to try and figure out what's the right choice. And you can see Hancock in real time trying to figure this out. Right. So no, I don't condemn loyalists at all.
All right. Rick does all the time.
I know it's not as that it's easier to present history in this very clear black and white way, but life isn't black and white. Right. And so anyway,
thank you for that.
Being descendant of loyalists. As for John Hancock being an opportunist, that's an absolutely fair charge to level against him. The difference is two sort of things. I would say, one, show me a man at this time who was in politics who wasn't an opportunist, who wasn't doing something for themselves. And then the other part I would say is that Hancock, he didn't make money during the Revolution. He died with less than he inherited. And there's several reasons for that. But there were men who financially profited from the war, and Hancock isn't one of them. What he gains, and we've talked about this, is that he gains that popularity and that feeling of belonging that he so desperately wanted.
So your book is great because it goes into a lot of detail about a lot of stuff that I haven't seen in a number of other books. And one of the things that I kind of was attracted to is you tell the story of one of Hancock's critics, who's a man named John Mean, M-E-I-N.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Who is a Scottish immigrant who comes to the colonies and who runs a bookstore, and he kind of seems to have a grudge against Hancock from early on. And you devote a fair amount of space to this, not only to Mean and his complaints, but to how Hancock handles it. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and part of the reason I devoted the space I did was to what Chris and I were just chatting about, is to show that the revolution wasn't a steady march towards the Declaration of Independence with everyone going all in. And even though some rebels, some patriots had decided to not import goods because of the Townshend duties passed, those were attacks on imported British goods. And so many colonies, and eventually all 13 in North America, decide to boycott British goods, because if you didn't import them, you wouldn't have to pay the tax. And Hancock is one of the leaders of this boycott. And John Main, this newspaper printer, begins to use the Patriots' non-importation agreement against them, saying, actually, some of you are importing goods to enrich yourselves, or you're playing fast and loose with some of your own agreements. And so John Main did what the Patriots did, which was publish the names of importers on his first page of the newspaper. So Eads and Gill did that for the Boston Gazette to intimidate people from not importing, because if your name was listed as an importer, then many people would be upset with you. But Maine flips that and says, well, John Hancock actually imported goods that were in violation of this non-importation agreement, and here's the manifest from the ship. And this is really problematic for Hancock. In fact, Maine is being a little unfair by saying that Hancock's importing goods that weren't allowed, because Hancock says these are allowed. Yes, they're from Britain, but there are some of those goods that are allowed. But Maine's publicity eventually makes Hancock have to stop importing. He says, don't send me anything at all, because it's too troublesome for him publicly to be seen as someone violating this agreement that he tried to get everyone else on board with. And then what he eventually does is he has powerful contacts in London. One of those London contacts is owed money by John Main, and Hancock eventually bankrupts John Main, trying to collect on this Londoner's debt.
So freedom of the press is great.
Yeah, on one side.
But maybe not so great if the press is against me. So that's maybe a little part of the opportunist.
I'm glad you picked that up, Rick.
I'm right. I'm swift. I'm on it.
Yeah, and the other component here too is that John Adams served as Hancock's lawyer to try and recover Maine's debts. So John Adams is right there in the thick of this as well.
If only the BBC had been, if there was a BBC America channel at that time, they would have been all over this. They would have had guests on, and it would have been a spectacle to see.
Well, in some sense, too, there is this happening because Hancock gets maligned in a Newport newspaper in Rhode Island, and he defends himself in a Pennsylvania newspaper and a New York newspaper. This isn't a transgression that just Boston is looking at. It's being observed by other colonies as well. And Hancock began by having one of his employees defend him. And then he had to come out himself and say, I've never imported, I'm being falsely represented. But it seemed enough. I couldn't find a letter or an account of someone saying exactly, oh, now we don't trust John Hancock. But there was enough back and forth in the media and enough discussion, as you're sort of alluding to, what might happen today. But back then there was, some back and forth in the newspaper, and Hancock eventually, it wouldn't do for his employee to defend himself. It had to be him.
So one of the other things that you talk quite a bit about in the book that is an interesting point, and it raises questions that we can talk about, but is his relationship with the masses or the lower orders or anything that you would want to say that. You have a quote in the book talking about this, and you say that an observer at the time saying, he is so frank and condescending to the lowest that one would think he was talking to his brother or a relative. And kind of a relationship like that at that time is unusual. You certainly don't see it with Adams or any others. So what is his relationship with people, quote unquote, beneath him? And do you think it's a genuine one, or is it?
I do actually think it's genuine. And that's what makes him so effective at it. If he was faking it, I don't think he would have been able to gain the popularity he did. And the account you just read is one of many when people say that he was good at mingling, he was good at connecting with people. I think he realized pretty early on where the power came from. And the power came from the lower orders working together in a group. They could be very intimidating, especially in Boston. They had a history of mob violence, which was permitted at the time in some social way, to say If you have a grievance and you mob against that grievance, if that grievance is addressed, well, then you have to stop mobbing. And so Hancock saw the power of mob violence, and he also, so he knew that if he was to remain popular, it should be with those people. But he also loved to entertain. He loved to host people in his home and at taverns and he would pay for it. And this was, again, a way that he connected with people. Alcohol brings people together.
It does.
I'll tell you to that.
Here we are.
Here we are, yes. And Hancock was so smart about that, about buying people food and drink and bringing them together. And that helped build this popularity in Boston, and then the countryside of Massachusetts, and then the other colonies. And I do find that it was sincere. There's one instance that you may recall in the book, it comes much later, when he's governor of Massachusetts, Hancock is, and he's hosting at least one French aristocrat in his home. And the Frenchman writes that he says there was a hatter at the dinner. That means a person who made hats. That is far beneath Hancock's station as a governor and far beneath a French aristocrat. And he says, and the governor was friendly with him. And you can tell that the French aristocrat is puzzled. And maybe he doesn't indicate tone in the letter, but he could be annoyed by it or find it humorous or just quirky. But this is what makes me think it's sincere. He's not putting something on. He's hosting a hatter who was a good friend of his. I believe it's the hatter Nathaniel Balch, who was a friend of his, with others who would usually not be mingling with a hatter.
So John Hancock is very prominent in Massachusetts. He is he's in Lexington when the British march on Lexington and Concord. He and Samuel Adams together ride to Philadelphia, to the cheers of crowds as they get there. But how does John Hancock get appointed president of the Continental Congress? He's not a great military man, although he kind of dreams of being. He is an orator, but he's not a great orator. He's not a great thinker about ideology. Why is he appointed president of the Continental Congress at what is going to turn out to be the most critical time of this Congress?
Yeah, the moment for him. He gets appointed because he's a moderate. The first president of the Second Continental Congress was Peyton Randolph from Virginia, and he was also the president of the First Continental Congress. He gets called home to Virginia to tend to colony legislative matters, and they look north for their next president. So Massachusetts was a populous state. It had a tremendous amount of clout because so many revolutionary activities took place there. Samuel Adams was too radical to serve as a president. I mean, he would not have been a popular choice, for example. But Hancock had that name recognition. He was wealthy, so he had more to lose than an Adams cousin, John or Samuel, for example. But he also had revolutionary credentials. He was supposed to be that target on the morning of the battles of Lexington and Concord. His persecution by the British was known by other colonies. So he satisfied sort of all sides. That he was conservative because of his wealth and his track record of sort of going in and then out. He's from Massachusetts, strong revolutionary credentials. And then he himself has some history of being a very against the British Empire and taking strong stands. But this is the single most important in his life, and he wouldn't have known it. No one would have known it at the time, that this would be what propels him for us to all know his name today.
So, but of course, what we know his name for mostly is his signature, right?
Yes.
So, for those of us watching, why else should we remember him? What else? What is his role in Congress, and is he successful at it? Is he good? What part does he play in that Second Continental Congress?
So beyond
writing his name.
Yeah, so the president serves as mostly a moderator to filter ideas, and it's a very demanding job because the Congress would meet in 2 sessions, and Hancock had a secretary assigned to him, and then he needed another at some point, and at some point his wife was helping out with some of his sort of administrative duties. He is the longest serving president of the Second Continental Congress. And that's saying something because and he served for 2 years. So most delegates would not be able to serve that long. So just that commitment alone to shepherding the United States during the outbreak of war and the first 2 years and declaring independence meant that he was doing a great job at overseeing a chaotic Congress. They had to move several times because of British troops arriving, and Hancock was overseeing all of that. Now, your question about why we should remember him is I think, a very different question, because I don't think it's tied to Congress, to his time serving in Congress specifically. And we can get into it, but that's why we know him. And Rick, you put up the picture, but his signature is the biggest by far. And even though this isn't really something that can be judged except by your eyes, it is one of the most beautiful signatures.
When he's got I was going to make a zoom in and I didn't, but he's got almost like a logo under his name.
Yeah, it's called a parif. And that was a sign of gentility. It showed training and practice to be able to sign like that. And I encourage everyone who's listening, and by the way, thanks for tuning in,
Yes, thank you.
Yes, we thank you also.
To Google the Declaration of Independence. The National Archives has it on their website. That's the keeper of the Declaration. And zoom in, because there's some attempts at parifs, those markings underneath the name, that are pretty clumsy. And
from other people.
What's that?
From other people.
From other delegates. And then if you really look at it, I mean, Hancock's signature is spectacular. There's just nothing, there's no other way to say it. And I think that he's the first to sign the Declaration of Independence and have such a beautiful signature is something that is poetic.
Now, but do you suppose that, I guess this would be a cartoon, right? Would be Hancock signs, it crumples up that one. He signs, I'm not quite, he crumples up that. Maybe he crumples up 3 or 4 or 5 of these. Then he signs it. Then everybody else has to actually get theirs right the first time, but he's got multiple times to do it.
Yeah, that would be a cartoon for sure. You've got one shot, but this is kind of my point, is that that parif being perfectly executed showed training and practice. There is a letter from 1764 of Hancock's, or 1765, and the signature is very similar. The parif changes a little in the 11 years, but this was even the Olive Branch petition signed just the year before. The signature is very similar. So this was something that he practiced a lot.
Can I bring in a question from Wally here? Wally wants to know, so was his signature first or just big in center page? And it was first, right? Because we have this image, Brooke, we have a photo. We have this image of everybody going there for the signing of the Declaration. But in fact, they don't do it that way, right?
That's right. So thanks for the question, Wally. He is biggest because he's the president of the Second Continental Congress, and also he tended to sign his name pretty large when compared to the scriptive letters. For example, the text of the letter, and then he would sign much bigger. He is the only one who needs to sign the Declaration to authorize it, and he does that on July 4th, not on the page we just saw. That engrossed copy was made by Congress and signed by most people in August of 1776. But not everyone signed the same day. So Hancock's is first and center because he's the president. It's really, that's the only reason, because he was the only one needed. And then the rest of the delegates signed below according to their colony. So the Massachusetts delegates are all lumped together, and the Virginia and Pennsylvania.
So one of the other things I wanted to get into a little bit, because it's a very interesting part of your book, and picking up on the idea of Congress, president of the Continental Congress, eventually he's there the longest. It's time for him to go. He's worn himself out, and he's getting ready to ride off into the sunset, and people are talking about giving him a formal thank you from Congress.
Yeah.
And it's shot down. And interestingly, it's shot down in part by most of the members of his own state's delegation. And in fact, Adams in particular is opposed to this idea. So why doesn't he get the thanks of Congress? And maybe roll that into what's Adams' beef with Hancock? Because it seems to be a pretty big beef.
Yeah, it's a big decades-long beef. Yeah. Okay. When Hancock is leaving, they say we should vote to vote to send a formal thank you to Hancock for being the president. And Adams opposes, saying this: you're not serving for a thank you, you're serving because greater good. But I found many instances of where Congress issues a formal thank you to somebody, so it's not that unusual. But Samuel Adams, the beef with Hancock extends for decades, really begins in the 1760s and goes until the 1780s. Adams, Samuel, and also John, but I'll talk really specifically about Samuel, finds Hancock to be too showy, too ostentatious, too concerned with public image. He also finds him too moderate. I think that's the real problem, is that Adams wants Hancock to lend his weighty name, his social influence, to Adams's causes and oppositions to British rule at the time. And Hancock doesn't do his bidding that much. Sometimes he'll go along with Adams, but he isn't as malleable as he might seem to be. So that's part of the beef, and it only gets reconciled in the late 1780s, and we can talk about that or not. But part of it is that Hancock just sort of offends his sensibilities about what it means to be a legislator at this time. And I think in some ways, Adams misses the point. He thinks that Hancock is popular because, or he's offended that Hancock's popular because he's showy. But that's part of why Hancock was popular. He was so skilled at using his public image, which, as we've said, is so visibly above those that he's seeking votes from or support from. He uses it to such great skill that I think that annoys Adams, that someone can care so much about their clothing and their presentation and entertaining, these sort of things that Adams thinks no one should care about, but Hancock uses them to great effect.
So let me ask you a question that I'm just curious about. It's not something you mentioned in the book, but there's a saying which I'm going out on a limb here, supposedly comes from colonial times, but I don't have the source, so I could be wrong, which was a description of the relationship between Hancock and Adams, which was that Adams writes the letters and Hancock pays the postage.
Right. Yeah.
Give me a response on that.
Variations of this that John Adams, much later in his life, much later, he writes that he and Samuel were walking through Boston and they paused at the base of Beacon Hill and looked up to Hancock's mansion at the top of Beacon Hill. And there we go. Nicely done, Rick. They look up at the base and Samuel says to John, Boston has done a wise thing by electing Hancock today. This is in 1765. For they've made that young man's fortunes their own. Now, I don't buy that story at all because it's saying that somehow Samuel Adams and John Adams knew that there would be a war more than a decade later, that somehow they'd form their own country. So that story is, I think, John Adams looking back and trying to figure things out and line up Samuel Adams' cunning and smarts and ability to see the future. So to your point, there's a lot of stories about Hancock's fortune being used to pay for the revolution. But that isn't really a charge that we hear from his contemporaries while he's alive, whether charge being good or bad. They don't use it as his credit, saying, "Oh, he paid for this," and certainly his supporters would have said something like that. So I think it's a way to understand the revolution after the fact, and in some ways, Chris, this might get at your question too about his popularity and how he's remembered. That maybe as people were trying to find a place for him, they say, "Oh, his place was because he was wealthy." So I don't know the origin of why that story came about, but it comes later, after his death.
Well, I was going to kind of add to the kind of the conversation because it touches on Rick's question and my earlier one. But I mean, a lot of the things that were, I guess, popularly known about him is that are impressions that Adams leaves. Like, that whole, he really wanted to be general.
Yeah.
I mean, so was a lot of what we know about, is that true? Or is that just Adams being jealous that Hancock was the cool kid at the party and he wasn't?
I think it's the latter there.
Yeah.
John Adams specifically, as you all may know, he's a terrific gossip. He has something to say about everyone, but rarely himself. And he criticizes far and wide. He resents the attention that George Washington gets. He resents the attention Benjamin Franklin gets, John Hancock gets. I mean, he really, it seems like sour grapes a lot of times. We do know a lot about Hancock from his contemporaries, from what they said about him, both positive and negative. So that's certainly true. But it's not just John Adams where we get a sense of who he is, because that wouldn't be enough for me. For example, you read that quote about him treating everyone like a brother or a relative. That's from just an observer of Hancock.
Right.
So was it, I mean, writing about John Hancock, he's not leaving behind the volume of letters, that diaries, et cetera, that John Adams or Alexander Hamilton left behind, or George Washington. Did that make it harder to write about him because you're kind of harder to get inside his head about what he's doing?
Yeah, certainly. There's so many times where the record is silent, just silent, and I want something from him. But there's enough that we can to get a sense of him, certainly, of his own writings. It's just not the volumes that some of the other founders left. Not at all.
And so you just said founders, and one of the questions I wanted to put to you, and it seems to be as good a place as any, is Hancock in the first tier of the founding fathers, or is he a secondary player? I know many shows ago, Rick and I had a very intense discussion about a certain finance person and whether he was actually a founding father or he kind of came along later, Mr. Hamilton. So would you consider, was Hancock, is he a Washington, a Jefferson, or is he just kind of there?
Well, I think I need to know your tiers. I need to know your last person in tier 1 and your first in tier 2 to know where he lands.
Who's your first in tier 2, Chris?
Who's my first in tier 2? Well, I'm the wrong person to ask this question.
Elbridge Gary?
I mean, sure. No.
He's way ahead of Elbridge Gary.
Okay. So for
Hancock is tier 1.
All right. Yeah. So Samuel Adams, he causes a lot of trouble. He gets everybody riled out. People start shooting at each other, and he's gone. He's just like not even part of the equation. He's not helping to craft great bills of state. He's not. So Hancock. So I would call Sam Adams a second tier.
Okay.
Ooh, that's harsh.
Well, you asked.
No, I didn't. Well, I did ask.
So
Okay.
tier 1, are we talking tier 1's Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, John Adams?
Yeah.
And then
guys that are on coins and money.
Right, I know, but right. This is
Why isn't John Hancock on a $5 bill?
Thank you.
I mean, he should be on money, if for no other reason than because he was so wealthy.
He was a money guy.
Yeah, I mean, who gets put on money? That's a whole different discussion. But
next week on History Happy Hour, who gets put on money and why?
If you're putting Samuel Adams in tier 2, and I counted 5 for your tier 1, then Hancock would probably be tier 2.
Okay.
But if you were living in 1790 and reflecting back on the revolution, the beginning in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War, Hancock would be a tier 1. I think that's what's kind of tricky about it, is he was so popular nationally that and people knew his name, they knew his sacrifices during the time, they knew him for the Declaration of Independence, and then when he supported the Constitution, which wasn't a given that he would or that Massachusetts would ratify. So even Elbridge Gerry, your tier 2, Rick, gives Hancock credit for, he said his name will basically live on because of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So
I think Elbridge Gerry is tier 3.
Yeah,
how dare you?
Yeah. I think
if you can only be vice president, I mean, come on.
So with these sort of imprecise tiering systems,
we'll
I think if he lived at the time, he would have been tier 1.
Okay, but he's gone down in the, maybe to tier 2. So listen, so we've been talking a lot about politics, and we will some more. But hey, let's get into some gossip, like John Adams would like.
Yes.
So John Hancock gets married in 1775, and he marries Dolly Quincy, who actually was there with him in Lexington, along with his Aunt Lydia, at the Hancock Clark House, and 14 other people who were there on the night of April 18th, 1775. But he's almost 40 when he gets married, which is kind of old. And he's married till his death. But you kind of suggest that it's a little bit one-sided of a relationship. That he's writing to her a lot, and she's not writing back much, and it sort of suggests that maybe there's a little coolness there. But can you delve into that relationship a little bit?
Yeah, and this is one of those instances where Dolly is silent. We don't hear from her at all. It is not that we don't hear from Hancock in these instances. It's that we don't hear from her, which is telling you something. So he is very old by 18th century standards, North American English standards, to get married. He had courted a woman before that for 10 years before calling it off, and that's very unusual too. Dorothy Quincy who goes by Dolly. Dorothy Quincy comes from a good family. That is a strong name. The name of Quincy, Massachusetts, comes from her lineage. So it's a good match for him because of the name, and then of course it's a good match for her because of his name and wealth. But she is decidedly not interested in Hancock. It seems socially that it could be because his work was so demanding at times that she didn't feel any connection to him, that she didn't see him that much, and it was all driven by work. We have an account from her much later in her life. She told somebody who then wrote it down that she didn't like being in Philadelphia during the Second Continental Congress. She was one of the only wives at a time. She was the only wife there and had to help Hancock with some of these administrative duties. And that didn't appeal to her at all. So that could have been part of the reason for the coldness, is that she just didn't feel connected to him because he was busy with work. They also just may have it was a match in good names, and it was finally time for Hancock to get married, but it is not a fulfilling relationship, it seems.
And you write about the fact that he writes to her and says, "Why won't you write me? I'm writing you all the time. You're not responding to me. Please write me a letter. I beg you, write me a letter." And she just doesn't.
Yeah, and he says, "I'm sending you a gift. Like, please let me know if you liked it. Did you did you see if the fabric suits you? Here's a gift for our daughter." And he poses, it's really sad because he writes at one point and says, let's make a deal. I'm using modern language. He didn't say this, but this is the crux of it, that let's make a deal. I'll write you one letter and then you write me one back, and then I'll write you one, and letters, nothing. So yeah, I mean, the other thing is, I will just say, I guess, not even in Dolly's defense, she can feel however she wants about him, but but she is not the only person that Hancock pleads with for more letters. He writes, this comes through his correspondence a lot. Please write me. Please tell me what's happening. I don't hear enough from my friends in Boston. So it's not just Dolly that he's wanting those letters from. And this gets back to one of the ways we started this conversation, is that Hancock just loves to connect with people. And at this time, getting a letter from someone meant a lot to him, and he didn't get it enough in his mind.
So I do want to, we've talked quite a bit and we're getting closer to the end. So I don't want to leave out kind of the rest of the story, because one of the things that you talk about, I think, very effectively, and it's important, is his role in the Constitution, and how we, that it's on a knife edge. And I don't think that that's a part of the story that we know enough about. So tell us a little bit about kind of his place in that. And also, if you could maybe tack on sort of his view of how these states are supposed to now function as a country, because I would say it's a little bit different.
Yeah, to just quickly address your second question first, he doesn't know how the states are going to function under this new federal government. I mean, that's part of the problem. Right. But to back up and go with your first question, while we think of the Constitution today, because it still governs the United States today, as being inevitable almost, it certainly wasn't. Its ratification was anything but assured. And by the time it got to Massachusetts to ratify, 5 states had already ratified. And you only needed 9. The Constitutional Convention decided unilaterally that you don't need 13 states to ratify, you just need 9. And so they're already halfway to this point, but Massachusetts hasn't weighed in by contemporaries. This isn't a historian saying this after the fact. This is people at the time saying that they were considered, in essence, a swing state, that if they ratified, New Hampshire likely would, New York would likely be more likely, Virginia would be more likely to ratify. Because it had a high population and because of its strong revolutionary credentials. George Washington and James Madison even write, saying, Washington says, we will be affected here being Virginia, by what happens in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, it was about 50-50, split for and against the Constitution. With if we had to tip the scales, historians believe that it tips more towards not ratifying than ratifying. And Hancock is the president of the ratifying convention in Massachusetts, and he's governor, and he's the most popular man in Massachusetts still. And so Federalists, that is those who support the Constitution, the ratification, know that that's their guide and lobby.
So yeah, I'm sorry.
We can talk more. I just didn't want to.
But he comes in and to the convention and favors the Constitution, as long as they can also say, well, as long as we can also get a Bill of Rights, right?
Yeah, he doesn't use that term, Bill of Rights, but the Federalists lobby him, and they say, if you come out in support, they have a couple of really enticing prospects. They say you might become president if Virginia doesn't ratify. Everyone knew that if Virginia ratified it, George Washington would be president. Then they said, well, you might become vice president if you ratify. So they were dangling this very appealing prospect out to Hancock. And they also said, if you ratify, you can make changes. You can propose changes to the Constitution. And no state had done that yet, partly because the rules for ratification said you ratify it or you don't. you either take this new system or we keep the broken Articles of Confederation. And so this was something new. And I think the Federalists, I mean, they wouldn't have offered this if they could have gotten it to ratify assuredly without it. And so Hancock stands up at the convention in a very dramatic moment and says that he's going to come forward and vote to ratify, but that he has these proposed changes. And every state thereafter proposes changes to the Constitution. And all those changes, also amendments, get sent to James Madison, and they ultimately filter down to the 10 Bill of Rights that we know today. So while we think of the Bill of Rights as inseparable from the Constitution, it was actually passed a couple years later and wasn't part of the framers of the Constitution original goal. So it's for those that had the Bill of Rights is, we can look to those who had concerns about the Constitution as the reason we have it today.
Chris, did you have one more?
Well, no, I was going to say one of the to biographers in particular, I like to ask. Obviously, there's an awful lot in the book, and there's an awful lot that we didn't get to cover that you'll read about when you buy your own copies. But what is the thing that you wanted to put in the book that you couldn't, or what would you like to add? What else should we know about Hancock that they're not going to find out in the book?
What I wish I could have put in the book, as far as I know, doesn't exist. And that is where the records are silent. There's more that I would have wanted to know about his relationship to the people who worked for him, both enslaved and then when emancipated as paid servants. I would have wanted to know more about his relationships and with women, what that courtship was like for 10 years and then to call it off. So the juicy stuff is in the book. Stuff didn't get cut. It's more what I couldn't add because we didn't have the source. I didn't have the sources for them.
Yeah, I want to be clear, folks. There's plenty in the book, and I'm not saying she left anything out. I just want to make sure that.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and okay, but last question, and now we're in the lightning round.
All
okay, right. But should have been the first question. Why is the book called King Hancock?
Yeah.
That's so major. Okay, lightning round. After the Boston Tea Party in 1774, the British occupied Boston, British officers, and they question this guy named Samuel Dyer, a Bostonian, and they say, who ordered the destruction of the tea? That is the Boston Tea Party. And he says, nobody. And this British officer says, you're a damned liar. It was King Hancock and the damned Sons of Liberty. That is the first time in 1774 that we hear this nickname being used, and it's being used derisively as an insult. It's clever because it captures Hancock's immense popularity, but it also puts down the colonists for being these sort of bumpkins that the best they can do as a king is this guy on the top of Beacon Hill, John Hancock. Okay, here's where it gets interesting, and this you have to hear as part of this story, is on the day that the Revolutionary War began in Lexington and Concord, the battles of Lexington and Concord, British troops have to retreat 20 miles out of Concord home to Boston. And they are being fired on by colonists in the countryside the whole way home. And it's worse than just being fired on. They can't see where they're being fired from because colonists are hiding behind walls and inside homes. And so these British soldiers are being fired on. They can't see their attackers. And then their humiliation continues because colonists cry out as the British are retreating, King Hancock forever. So they had taken this insult and appropriated it to make it a rallying cry on the day the fighting began. That is Hancock's power. At the time, he'd be a tier 1.
That's the title of the revised copy. King Hancock, a tier 1.
Well done, John Hancock. Well done, Brooke Barbier. Thank you so much for joining us today. Brooke's book is King Hancock. And it's the story of John Hancock. There's that great signature on the cover. It's definitely worth a read. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. She's got them all. Thank you so much. Chris, I want to remind people, we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, but I want to remind people that I am going to be speaking at a World War II convention
You're
in
going to be working on your tan.
Tampa, Florida,
Yes.
which is in January, and it's called A New Look at World War II, How American Technology and Diversification Helped Win World War II in 1944 and started the American military, the new American military. And I'm pasting the link there. It's January 25th through 27th. I've pasted the link into the chat so people can copy that. I'm going to be there. Alex Kershaw is going to be there. Helen Patton is going to be there. Todd DiPastino, who wrote that great book about the cartoonist, Bill Malden.
Yes.
Is going to be there. And so it should be a great event. So please check that out.
And you'll get to see Rick in Bermuda shorts.
And you get to see me in Bermuda shorts or something. I don't know exactly, but we'll work that out. Here's the there it is. Okay, there it is on the screen also. Next week, Chris.
Yeah.
Next week.
Yeah, I'm really excited. We have David Kenyon, and he's talking about his new book on the Bletchley Park's role in the Arctic convoys in the war. Battle of the Atlantic. And for those of you who don't know, David Kenyon is the historian for Bletchley Park, and he wrote an absolutely stellar book about the role that Bletchley Park played on D-Day. So I'm really looking forward to talking about his next book, because I'm sure it will be out of sight.
And he is the man responsible for historical research in support of all public content at Bletchley. So he's very knowledgeable. It's a terrific book. I read it, and it's got stuff about the signal intelligence, but it's also these battles on the convoy run up to Murmansk involved aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, merchant ships, airplanes. It was in waves, a lot of cold waves.
A lot of cold waves.
So, pretty incredible. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.